All right, we're talking about Chapter 10, the muscular system. So this little topic is going to correspond with the muscular system notes that you have in your modules under Canvas. And so in looking at the muscular system, if we think of the function of the muscular system, obviously the first thing we think about is movement or motion. It's the muscular system, skeletal muscle that allows us to change position. Whether it's walking, whether it's raising your hand to ask a question, moving your fingers or your hand, skeletal muscle is allowing us to move to change position in space. Related to that, and what we sometimes don't think about, is our ability to simply maintain a position. I'm standing. You're sitting at a computer, you're holding your head up, you're sitting up straight. Our ability to overcome gravity and maintain a position in space also requires muscle activity, muscle contraction. Although a lot of times we don't think about that. I'm not standing in front of you thinking about contracting the muscles in my feet or the muscles in my leg so that I stand up. But it's happening, and it's allowing, at a subconscious level, it's allowing me to maintain a position so that I can do other things. And then, of course, if we exercise, the byproduct of contracting muscle is going to be the generation of heat. So if you think of shivering when you're cold, for example, sweating, or the need to sweat when you exercise is because the byproduct of these muscle contractions is the generation of heat. So the first thing that we look at when we think of the muscular system or individual muscles are going to be things called origins and insertions. Origins and insertions are the attachment of a muscle to a bone. And when we think of a muscle creating movement, a muscle is able to create movement because when it contracts, it pulls on a bone. Well, when we start to look at these attachments, all individual muscles are going to have an origin. They're going to have an attachment that's usually proximal, but the origin is usually fixed. It's usually not the bone that we're pulling on to create movement. The insertion of a muscle becomes the attachment point that is creating the movement. So it is usually distal. If we think of the deltoid muscle in the top of the shoulder, the origin of that muscle is around the spine of the scapula and the clavicle. The insertion of the muscle is down on that deltoid tuberosity. So if you think of this muscle contracting, what's it pulling on? Is it pulling on the clavicle and the spine of the scapula, or is it pulling on the humerus? It's pulling on that deltoid tuberosity of the humerus, so when the muscle contracts, we abduct and we get movement of the arm. Think about doing a curl. Your bicep muscle, its origin is up on the coracoid process and up on the glenoid. Its insertion is on the radius. So when we contract the bicep muscle, what moves? We're pulling on the insertion, we're pulling on the radius, and we can perform the curl motion. So I'm going to show you on the skeleton as well, but we think of these origins and insertions. All muscles have them. It's where we are attaching to the bone. The origin, proximal, usually fixed, immovable. Insertion, distal, movable. It's the segment that we're pulling on to move the limb. Okay, so when we look at origin and insertion on the skeleton, one of the things that we notice on the skeletons in the lab is that one half of the skeleton is nice and white, it's clear, and on the other half of the skeleton we've got all of these red and blue marks all over it. Well, all of these red and blue marks are the origins and insertions for various muscle. So in this case, anything that we see in red is an origin. It's the beginning of a particular muscle. The blue that we see is going to be the insertion. It's going to be that distal attachment or that movable attachment of a muscle. So for example, if we look at the posterior portion of the scapula, here we see that infraspinous fossa, maybe a little difficult to see the supraspinous fossa, but these areas are in red. They're origins for those muscles the rotator cuff, that's going to insert on, let's say, the greater tubercle or the lesser tubercle of the humerus. And so again, when that muscle contracts, it pulls on that insertion and creates movement of that bone wherever that insertion is. And so as we were to look kind of up and down the right-hand side of the skeleton, we see origins and insertions all over the place on many different bones. And again, we probably can't see close enough, but it's going to tell us the specific muscle that would be attaching in that location. So if you think of the pectoralis major, think of doing a bench press or a push-up. We have this very broad attachment across the sternum, the clavicle, the ribs for pectoralis major, and then it's going to insert here on the humerus. So if you think of doing a bench press, when that muscle contracts, it's going to pull the arm in that bench press, punching type of motion. Think of doing a push-up or whatever. So origin, insertion. We see it, that direct attachment onto the bones. Okay, all right, so now we're going to talk about some muscle actions and some relationships of muscle, if you will, when we start to think about how we move. Some of these different types of ways that muscles are going to interact with each other to create movement. So the first thing that we're going to look at is what we call an agonist versus antagonist relationship. This gets a little bit tricky. When we think of agonist versus antagonist, the first thing we have to think of is how are we trying to move? So we're going to look at the elbow to begin with. I want you to think of doing a curl. When we do a curl, we're flexing the elbow. Now, which muscle group is involved in flexing the elbow? Well, we give all the credit to the bicep muscle. There's also a muscle underneath of it called the brachialis. So the biceps is pulling on the radius, brachialis is pulling on the ulna. Both of those muscles are creating elbow flexion. So they are considered the agonist for elbow flexion. They are the muscle creating the movement. The agonist, the muscle creating the movement. The antagonist would be the muscle that would do the opposite movement. So in the case of elbow flexion, bicep is the agonist. We'll just worry about the biceps. Bicep is the agonist. Who's the antagonist? Who does the opposite? The triceps. And so that's an agonist-antagonist relationship. Let's reverse it. Let's say we were talking about elbow extension. I'm going to straighten my elbow. Well, who does that? The triceps. So the triceps now becomes the agonist. Who's the antagonist? That other muscle group, the biceps and the brachialis. So the key to the agonist-antagonist relationship is that any muscle in the body can be an agonist, and any muscle in the body can be an antagonist. It specifically depends on which movement, what joint motion are we looking at. If we're looking at elbow flexion, biceps is the agonist, triceps is the antagonist. If we're looking at elbow extension, triceps becomes the agonist, biceps becomes the antagonist. Now, the question becomes, so what? Why do we care about that? Well, if you think about smooth, continuous movement, if I'm going to move my arm through space, if my agonist is contracting, what do we want the antagonist to do? Well, the answer is, we want the antagonist to relax. If I'm trying to do a curl, if my bicep muscle is firing and allowing me to move my arm through space, it's doing that because the tricep, the antagonist, is shut off. Now, later in the semester, we're going to talk more about movement, but the brain takes care of that for us. The only thing we worry about is where do we want to be in space. The brain takes care of everything else. I don't think about, oh, I'm going to get a drink of water. I'm going to scratch my nose. Oh, I better contract my bicep muscle. I better relax my tricep muscle. We don't worry about that. The brain takes care of that. All we're concerned with is, I want to get a bite of that candy bar. I want to get a drink of water. I'm going to scratch my face. I just determine where I want my hand to go in space. The brain takes care of everything else. So, when we think of firing a muscle group to be able to move, we want that other muscle group, most of the time, to relax, to allow us to move. So think of some of your neurological diseases. Parkinson's disease, for example. We start to see a tremor. Maybe we get rigidity with movement. Why? Because we're deciding where we want to go in space, but the brain is not doing its job. It's not inhibiting those antagonistic muscles that are trying to now fire at the same time as the agonist. So that's agonist-antagonist relationship. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is what we call a synergy. Now, forget about muscle for a second. What's a synergy? A synergy we typically think of, if I were to bring 5 or 6 of you students together, you're all going to bring special skills and talents together. So if we're going to complete a project, the project that we get from you as a group is going to be very different than a project that we might get if you worked on it individually, because everybody is bringing their own special set of skills and talents to whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. Muscle's the same way. Each muscle, because of its origin and insertion, has a very specific movement that it can do, that it can provide. So if we contract a muscle by itself, there's only one movement that we can get. But if we contract multiple muscles at the same time, I might get a new movement. I might get something that one muscle by itself can't do. So I want you to think about your bicep muscle. Put your hand on your biceps and simply do a curl. I think we can probably all agree that you feel that bicep muscle contracting underneath the skin. And if we were to hook up an EMG, we would feel muscle activity. Now, bend your elbow to 90 degrees, keep your hand on that bicep muscle, and very quickly turn your palm up and down. As you supinate, as you turn the palm up, you should be feeling that bicep muscle contracting. And again, if we were to hook up an EMG, we would see that the bicep muscle is firing. When I curl, it's also firing when I turn the palm up. Say, opening up a door, turning a screwdriver. So the question becomes, how does the bicep muscle fire in 2 very different movements? We all agree, curl is different than supination, but same muscle, 2 different movements. The obvious answer is, because we're talking about synergies, turning the palm up, supinating is a synergy. The bicep muscle is contracting. The tricep muscle is also firing to maintain elbow position. And there's a muscle in the forearm called the supinator that's also contracting at the same time to pull on the radius. So the combination of bicep, tricep, supinator gives me a new movement. These muscles are working in synergy together to create something that any one of those muscles can't do by itself. So that's a synergy. The other thing that we find when we start to look at muscle function is something called fixation. Sometimes we have to contract a muscle to hold something in place so something else can move. And the best example of that would be your fingers and your wrist. I have all of these muscles, tendons, on the anterior portion of my carpal bones running to my hand. I have tendons on the posterior side running to the back of my hand. So I've got flexors on one side, I've got extensors on the other side. Well, we never think about this, but isolate movement in your hand. I can flex my interphalangeal joints. I can flex my metacarpal phalangeal joints, or I could flex the carpals. So I've got all of these muscles on the anterior side that allow me to flex, but I can isolate movement. So how can I move my wrist and yet I'm not moving my fingers? How can I move my metacarpal phalangeal joints and yet not move my interphalangeal joints? How can I move my interphalangeal joints and yet I'm not moving my wrist and I'm not moving my metacarpal phalangeal joints? This isolation of movements is because of what we call fixation. Because I have muscles on both sides of the forearm, make a fist. Put one hand on your forearm and make a fist. And you feel muscle contraction on both sides. Why? Well, these muscles are curling my fingers. What are these muscles doing on the extensor side? They're fixating the wrist so that the wrist, when I curl, doesn't collapse. So fixation means I'm going to use muscle contraction to stabilize a joint, to hold a joint in place so that other muscles can function. And again, it's all about moving in space. Where do we want to be? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And the brain is going to take care of everything else and allow us to get to that position. Okay, the last thing that we want to talk about regarding muscle action is the difference between an isometric and isotonic action, and then we're going to talk a little bit about concentric and eccentric actions. So, isometric versus isotonic. When we think of muscle contraction, most of us think about movement. I contract my biceps and I do a curl. I contract my deltoid and I move to the side. I contract my pectoralis major muscles and I move my arms in. Not all muscle contraction results in movement. If I were to try to lift this table and I'm not overcoming the weight of the table, I will guarantee my bicep muscle is active, I feel muscles in my forearm active, but am I changing position? Is there any change in length? Any change in joint position? No, there's not. So the muscle could be active, but the muscle may not be changing in length. That's isometric. Simply take your hands and put your hands together in front of you and push. I can feel muscles in my upper arm, my shoulder, my chest working, but I don't have a change in position. That is isometric. Isotonic is what we think of typically when we're thinking about movement. We contract a muscle, we get a change in length, and we move through space. And so if you go to the health club, if you go to the fitness center, if you're walking, we usually think of isotonic actions. We're doing curls, we're doing a bench press, we're doing a lat pull down. We're contracting muscle, we're moving, we're changing position. Now, the extension of these isotonic actions, are they concentric or eccentric? So when you think of a muscle contracting, you usually think of that muscle as getting longer or shorter. We usually think of a muscle getting shorter. A muscle is pulling on a bone to create movement. And so we're taking that origin and insertion and we're moving them closer together. We're pulling the bone, the muscle's getting shorter, and movement occurs. A muscle action where the muscle is getting shorter is referred to as a concentric action. Concentric action, muscle contracts, muscle gets shorter. Well, for me to have a concentric action, I'm going to do a curl with these markers. You can go grab a 15 or 20 pound weight if you want to do this at home. Hold the weight at your side and perform a curl. For me to perform that curl, my muscle action has to overcome the weight of my arm, the weight of the markers in my hand, gravity's pull against my arm. And if I win, if I generate more force, I get movement. I have a concentric action of the bicep muscle. But now let's reverse it. What's an eccentric action? Eccentric is the muscle is active, it's contracting, but the muscle's actually getting longer. Now, we ask, how could that happen? We don't think of muscles as contracting and pushing bones apart, and they don't. So if we think of an eccentric action, the question is, what's generating the movement? What's creating the force? Well, if I were to hold these markers in my hand, and they are really heavy, and gravity is pulling these markers down toward the floor, but I don't want to allow them to drop. I'm holding on, and I'm holding on, but gravity's winning. Gravity is slowly pulling my arm down toward the floor. I am contracting my bicep muscle. I'm trying to hang on, but gravity is creating the movement. I'm resisting the movement. I'm active. I'm pulling as hard as I can. Gravity's winning. My muscle's getting longer. The origin and the insertion are being pulled away from each other. The muscle's still active. It's still trying to contract, but gravity's creating the movement. So think about a lot of our activities are eccentric. If you go hike Camelback Mountain, or if you walk down a flight of stairs, or you go to the gym and you do a squat workout or a lunge workout, gravity is pulling you down. Gravity's trying to pull you through the floor. And so we're using our muscles to resist gravity. If I'm going to do a squat, as soon as I commit myself to lowering, gravity is going to pull me to the floor. Unless I resist gravity's pull, I decelerate gravity so that I don't descend so quickly. Think about going to the gym. Maybe you did a squat workout or you did a lunge workout. What happens a day or two later? You're really sore. Why? Because all of those muscle actions of squatting, of lunging, and decelerating your gravity's pull is an eccentric load, and you're putting a greater strain on that muscle. And some of that is what we're going to talk about in Chapter 9 when we look at how muscle contracts and that sliding filament theory. So eccentric, muscles active, muscles getting longer because an external force, in this case gravity, is winning. It's creating the movement. Concentric, you're winning. You're overcoming gravity to create movement to change your position in space. Both of those, concentric and eccentric, are isotonic because we have a change in length. If I simply hold and resist gravity's pull, that would be isometric. But as soon as we get movement, we're switching into isotonic. So that's muscle actions.